Sarah's trembling hands clutched the pregnancy test as tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision of the Manhattan lawyer's office where her world was falling apart. The bright pink lines confirming her pregnancy seemed to mock her as she signed the divorce papers, her heart shattering with each stroke of the pen. At 26, she never imagined she'd be walking away from the man she loved, carrying his unborn child and holding the hand of her 2-year-old daughter, Emma. The prestigious law firm's 48th floor window offered a panoramic view of the city she'd have to leave behind. Alexander Chen, the billionaire CEO of Chen Innovations, would never know about this baby. The lies her ex-boyfriend James had spread about her past had poisoned everything, turning her fairy tale romance into a nightmare of whispers and suspicious glances. "Mrs. Chen," the lawyer called, his voice tinged with a mix of sympathy and professional detachment. "The papers are complete. Would you like a copy?" Sarah shook her head, gathering Emma closer to her side. The toddler looked up at her mother with innocent brown eyes, unaware of how their lives would change forever. "No, thank you. I just need to go." The elevator ride down felt eternal. Sarah's mind wandered to 6 months ago when everything had been perfect. She'd met Alexander at a coffee shop where she worked as a barista, studying part-time for her business degree. Despite their different social standings, they'd fallen deeply in love. Alexander had embraced Emma as his own, and Sarah had finally believed in second chances after her first relationship had ended badly when she was barely 20. But James, her vindictive ex, couldn't bear to see her happy. He'd fabricated stories about her past, painting her as a gold digger who had trapped multiple wealthy men with pregnancy claims. The whispers had reached Alexander's board of directors, threatening his position and the company's reputation. Sarah had watched helplessly as doubt crept into Alexander's eyes, fed by the relentless pressure from his family and business associates. Outside the building, the autumn wind whipped around her, matching the storm in her heart. She pulled out her phone, looking at the last text message she'd received from Alexander. "My lawyers will handle everything. It's better this way." The words still stung, even after reading them countless times over the past week. Sarah hailed a cab, helping Emma into the car seat she'd brought along. As they drove toward her small apartment in Queens, she allowed herself one last look at the towering skyscraper that housed Chen Innovations. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach, where Alexander's child grew, unknown to its father. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully in their modest one-bedroom apartment, Sarah began the painful process of packing their belongings. Her sister Rachel had offered them a fresh start in Boston, where she ran a small but successful bakery. It wasn't the life Sarah had imagined, but it would have to do. She couldn't bear the thought of Alexander discovering her pregnancy and assuming it was another manipulation, another lie. The next morning, Sarah stood in her empty apartment, holding Emma's hand and a small suitcase containing their essential belongings. The rest would be shipped later. Her gaze fell on the pregnancy test she'd left on the counter, a final reminder of what could have been. In a moment of both despair and determination, she picked it up and tore it into pieces, letting them fall into the trash can. "Mummy, why are you crying?" Emma's small voice pulled at her heartstrings. Sarah wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a smile. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're being brave, sweetheart. We're going on an adventure to see Aunt Rachel. Would you like that?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, her innocent excitement a balm to Sarah's wounded spirit. As they walked out of the apartment, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news notification. Chen Innovations, CEO Alexander Chen announces major European expansion. The photo showed him at a press conference, his handsome face serious and composed, showing no sign of the emotional turmoil she knew he must be feeling. On the train to Boston, as Emma napped against her shoulder, Sarah wrote 2 letters she knew she'd never send, one to Alexander, explaining everything about their child, and another to her unborn baby, promising to give them all the love she possessed. She sealed them in envelopes and tucked them into her journal, a testament to the life she was leaving behind. Rachel met them at South Station, wrapping them both in a warm embrace that smelled of vanilla and cinnamon from her bakery. "Welcome home," she whispered, and Sarah finally felt the first hints of hope sprouting through her grief. Here, she could build a new life, raise her children, and maybe someday heal from the wounds that love and lies had left in her heart. The reality of her situation hit her as they drove through Boston's unfamiliar streets. She was starting over completely. New city, new life, new identity. Sarah had already arranged to legally change back to her maiden name, Williams. It would be easier this way, she told herself, both for her and for Alexander. He could move on with his life, undisturbed by the complications of her pregnancy or the truth about James's lies. That night, in Rachel's cozy guest room, Sarah lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep. Her hand rested on her stomach, imagining the tiny life growing within. This child would never know their father, would never experience the warmth of Alexander's smile or feel the security of his embrace, but they would know love, fierce, unconditional love from their mother and sister. Looking at Emma's sleeping face and thinking of the baby growing within her, Sarah made a silent vow. She would give her children the best life possible, even if it meant leaving behind the man she loved and the dreams they'd shared. Sometimes, she realized, the bravest thing you can do is walk away, even when your heart begs you to stay. Tomorrow would bring a new dawn, and with it the beginning of their new life in Boston, far from the shadows of Manhattan's towering skyscrapers and the memories they held. 6 years had transformed Boston into home. Sarah Williams stood in her sister's thriving bakery, now a co-owner, watching the morning sunlight stream through the window. The aroma of fresh pastries filled the air as she arranged a display of elaborately decorated wedding cakes. At 32, she'd built a life she could be proud of, even if her heart still carried the weight of secrets. "Mom, can I have the blueberry muffin?" 6-year-old Matthew's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood at the counter, his dark eyes, so much like his father's, gleaming with hope. Next to him, 8-year-old Emma was already helping arrange cookies on a tray, showing the same determination Sarah saw in the mirror every day. "After you finish your homework, young man," Sarah replied, ruffling his jet-black hair. Every day, Matthew looked more like Alexander, from his strong jawline to the way he furrowed his brow when concentrating. The resemblance sometimes took her breath away. Rachel emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron. "The Chen Innovations Conference is all over the morning news," she said quietly, showing Sarah her phone. "They're opening their East Coast headquarters here in Boston." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stared at Alexander's image on the screen. 6 years had added distinguished touches of grey to his temples, but his presence still commanded attention. The article mentioned his recent string of successful technological innovations and philanthropic ventures. "We knew this might happen someday." Rachel squeezed her sister's shoulder. "Boston's a big city. What are the chances you'll ever cross paths?" Sarah nodded, but anxiety had already taken root in her chest. She'd built this life carefully, piece by piece. The bakery had grown from Rachel's small startup into a celebrated local business, featured in magazines and beloved by the community. Emma had blossomed into a bright, artistic third grader, while Matthew's intelligence and curiosity constantly amazed his teachers. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the bakery's accounts when Emma burst in. "Mom, can we go to the Prudential Center? Jessica's mom is taking her to get new shoes for the dance recital, and I need them too." Sarah checked her watch. The mall would be crowded on a Saturday, but Emma's recital was next week. "All right, let me get Matthew from his art class and we'll go." The Prudential Center buzzed with weekend shoppers. Sarah held Matthew's hand while Emma walked slightly ahead, chattering about her upcoming performance. They had just left the shoe store, Emma proudly carrying her new ballet slippers, when Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Alexander Chen stepped out of a high-end watch boutique, engaged in conversation with 2 executives. He looked exactly as she remembered, yet somehow more imposing in his perfectly tailored suit. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she instinctively pulled Matthew closer. But it was too late. Alexander's gaze swept the crowd and locked onto her face. She saw the moment of recognition, the widening of his eyes, the slight parting of his lips in surprise. Then his gaze dropped to Matthew, and Sarah watched as confusion, realization, and something like anger flashed across his features. "Keep walking," Sarah whispered to her children, trying to guide them toward the nearest exit. Emma, oblivious to the tension, stopped to tie her shoelace. Those precious seconds were all it took. "Sarah?" Alexander's voice carried across the space between them, deep and familiar, sending shivers down her spine. The executives with him exchanged glances, clearly recognizing her name. Emma looked up curiously. "Mom, who's that man?" Sarah forced herself to breathe normally, her protective instincts warring with the emotional storm inside her. "Just someone I used to know, sweetheart. Come on, we need to go." But Alexander was already moving toward them, his long strides eating up the distance. She could see the calculations happening behind his eyes as he looked at Matthew, taking in the boy's age, his features, the unmistakable resemblance. 6 years, he said softly, now standing before them. "You disappeared without a word." His gaze hadn't left Matthew, who was partially hiding behind Sarah's leg, suddenly shy. Sarah lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of strength she possessed. "You made it clear you didn't want any further contact when you sent the divorce papers." "And this?" Alexander gestured to Matthew, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Were you planning to keep this secret forever?" Emma, always perceptive, moved closer to her brother. "Mom?" Her voice wavered slightly, sensing the tension. A small crowd of shoppers had begun to notice them, some recognizing the famous CEO. Sarah could feel curious eyes on them, reminiscent of those judgmental stares from 6 years ago. "This isn't the place," Sarah managed, her voice barely steady. "Please, Alexander, not in front of the children." His jaw clenched, but years of business training helped him maintain his composure. "My office is 10 minutes from here," he said, pulling out a business card. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. We need to talk, Sarah, about everything." Sarah took the card automatically, her fingers brushing his in the process. That brief contact sent electricity through her arm, awakening feelings she'd tried so hard to bury. She nodded mutely, knowing she no longer had a choice. The secret she'd carried for 6 years had finally caught up with her. "Safe drive home," Alexander said formally, but his eyes lingered on Matthew for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked away, his shocked executives hurrying after him. In the car ride home, Emma asked questions Sarah couldn't fully answer, while Matthew remained unusually quiet, stealing glances at his mother in the rearview mirror. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities and fears. Tomorrow she would have to face not only Alexander, but also the consequences of her decisions from 6 years ago. The carefully constructed walls around her heart were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to rebuild them this time. Sarah arrived at Chen Innovations' Boston headquarters at exactly 8:55 a.m. The gleaming tower stretched toward the sky, a testament to Alexander's success over the past 6 years. After dropping the children at school, she'd spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally choosing a professional navy dress that made her feel somewhat protected. The executive elevator whisked her to the top floor, where Alexander's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, led her straight to his office. "Mr. Chen is expecting you," she said, opening the door to a sprawling corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Alexander stood at the window, his back to her. 6 years, 2 months and 14 days, he said without turning. "That's how long you've kept my son from me." "Alexander, Sarah began, but he cut her off, finally facing her. "Sit down, Sarah. We have a lot to discuss." His voice was controlled, but she could see the storm brewing in his eyes. She took a seat across from his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "First, show me his birth certificate," Alexander demanded, his businessman persona firmly in place. Sarah pulled the document from her purse, having anticipated this request. She watched as he read it, his jaw tightening at the sight of Matthew's full name, Matthew Alexander Williams. "You gave him my name," he said softly, something shifting in his expression. "I couldn't deny him that much of his father," Sarah whispered, "even if he didn't know it." Alexander placed the certificate carefully on his desk. "Why, Sarah? Why did you leave without telling me about him?" "Because you believed James's lies." The words burst from her before she could stop them. "You let your family, your board members convince you that I was some gold-digging opportunist. When those divorce papers arrived, I knew you'd think the pregnancy was just another manipulation." "I was a fool," Alexander admitted, surprising her. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "I've spent 6 years regretting that I let others influence me. But finding out about Matthew... Sarah, do you have any idea what you've taken from me?" Before she could respond, his office door burst open. James Camden strode in, looking exactly as Sarah remembered him. Handsome in a harsh way with cold eyes and a cruel smile. Her blood ran cold. "Well, if it isn't the little gold digger herself," James sneered. "I told you she'd try to worm her way back in, Alex." As soon as she heard about the Boston expansion, Sarah stood up, trembling. What is he doing here? Alexander looked equally shocked. James, this is a private meeting. Get out. Oh, but I think you'll want to hear this. James pulled out his phone. I have proof that Sarah's been planning this for months. She knew about the expansion before it was announced. She's after your money again. That's impossible, Sarah breathed. I had no idea until Rachel showed me the news yesterday. Really? James played a video on his phone. It showed Sarah outside the bakery apparently speaking to someone. The audio was edited to make it sound like she was plotting to use Matthew to get money from Alexander. That video is fake, Sarah said firmly, even as panic clawed at her chest. Alexander, you have to believe me. I've never wanted your money. I built my own life, my own business. Alexander stood silent, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then Rachel burst through the door, her face flushed with exertion. Thank God you haven't left, she gasped, then froze at the sight of James. You! I should have known you'd try something like this. Ms. Williams, James said smoothly, this doesn't concern you. Oh, but it does. Rachel pulled out her own phone. Because I have proof that you've been stalking my bakery for weeks, and I have security footage showing you breaking into our office last night to plant listening devices. The police are very interested in seeing it. Alexander's head snapped toward James, who had gone pale. What is she talking about? She's lying, James said quickly, but his confidence was cracking. The police are on their way up, Rachel continued, and they're bringing something interesting. Records of payments you received 6 years ago from someone in the Chen family. Would you like to explain those? The color drained from Alexander's face. Payments from my family? James, what did you do? Sarah watched as James's composure crumbled. Your mother wanted her gone, he blurted out. She said Sarah wasn't good enough for you, that she'd ruin everything. She paid me to create those stories, to make everyone believe Sarah was a gold digger. Alexander moved with sudden fury, grabbing James by his collar. My mother paid you to destroy my marriage, to separate me from my wife, my son. She was trying to protect you, James gasped. The company was about to go international. She said you needed someone from the right social circle, not some waitress with a kid. The office door opened again, this time revealing 2 police officers. Mr. Camden, we need you to come with us. As the police led James away, Alexander sank into his chair, looking shocked and devastated. My own mother, he whispered. Sarah, I had no idea. All these years, Sarah stood frozen, her world tilting on its axis once again. Your mother orchestrated everything. She died last year, Alexander said quietly. She never told me. She let me believe. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I let you go because I thought I was protecting the company, protecting myself from being used. Instead, I was the one being manipulated. I lost you. I lost my son. I lost 6 years we can never get back. Rachel touched Sarah's shoulder gently. The police want to talk to you both about pressing charges against James. And Sarah, you should tell him everything. Sarah took a deep breath, reaching into her purse for the worn journal she'd brought with her. Alexander, there's something else you need to see. The letters I wrote the day I left, I kept them all these years. As she handed him the journal, Sarah knew their lives were about to change again. The truth about his mother's manipulation had shattered the barriers between them, but rebuilding what they'd lost wouldn't be simple. Trust, once broken, takes time to heal, and they had 6 years of pain to overcome. Alexander's hands trembled as he read Sarah's letters, his eyes moving across pages filled with 6 years of unspoken truths. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office as he absorbed every word Sarah had written on that train journey to Boston, her fears, her love, her hopes for their unborn child. You wrote to him about me, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Every birthday, every milestone, you made sure he would know who I was, even if we never met. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. I couldn't bear the thought of him hating you. I told him his father was a good man who would have loved him if he'd known. I kept every article about your success, every picture. Matthew has a whole box of them under his bed. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window. I have to tell the board about this immediately, about James's confession, my mother's manipulation, everything. He turned to face her. But first, Sarah, I need to know, is there any part of you that could forgive me? For doubting you, for letting you go? Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. It was Emma's school. Her daughter's tearful voice came through the speaker. "Mom, Matthew got into a fight at lunch. He's in the principal's office." 20 minutes later, Sarah and Alexander rushed into the school together, finding Matthew sitting outside the principal's office with a split lip, while Emma hovered protectively nearby. The sight of them arriving together made both children's eyes widen. "What happened?" Sarah asked, kneeling before her son. Matthew's lower lip trembled. "Tommy said I was lying about having a dad. He saw us at the mall yesterday and recognized Mr. Chen from TV. He said I was making things up, that someone like him couldn't be my dad." He looked up at Alexander uncertainly. "But he is, isn't he? That's why we look alike. That's why you have the same name as my middle name." Alexander knelt beside Sarah, his eyes glistening. "Yes, Matthew, I'm your father, and I'm so sorry I haven't been here for you all these years. But you're here now." Matthew's voice was small, hopeful. "If you'll let me be." Alexander looked at Sarah, then back at their son. "I want to be part of your life, both of your lives." He included Emma in his gaze. "I never stopped loving your mother, and I already love you, even though we've just met." Emma stepped forward, her chin raised. "Are you going to make Mom cry again? Because I remember when she used to cry at night. I don't want that anymore." Alexander's face softened. "Emma, you've been so brave, taking care of your mom and brother. I promise you I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure none of you cry because of me again." The principal was understanding about the fight, given the circumstances. As they left the school, Alexander turned to Sarah. "Come to dinner tonight, all of you. There's so much we need to talk about, so much time to make up for." That evening, in Alexander's penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, they began the delicate process of becoming a family. Matthew showed Alexander his collection of newspaper clippings, while Emma cautiously shared her dance recital photos. Sarah watched them interact, her heart both healing and hurting at the sight. Later, after the children had fallen asleep on Alexander's plush couch, he and Sarah stood on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them. "I've had lawyers working all afternoon," Alexander said quietly. "James will face charges for harassment and corporate espionage. The evidence of my mother's involvement." He paused, pain crossing his features. "It will all come out. I won't hide the truth anymore." "What about the company, your reputation?" Sarah asked. Alexander turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I lost you once because I cared too much about those things. I won't make that mistake again. Sarah, I know we can't just pick up where we left off. We're different people now, shaped by these 6 years apart. But I want to try again, properly this time. No lies, no interference, just us." "And if I'm not ready," Sarah whispered. "If I need time, then I'll wait," he said simply. "I'll prove to you, to Emma, to Matthew, that I'm here for all of you. We can take it slow, build trust again. I just want a chance to be in your lives." Sarah looked through the glass doors at their sleeping children. "Matthew has your board game night every Thursday. He loves chess. And Emma's dance recital is next week. She has a solo." Alexander's face lit up with understanding. "I'll be there, for everything from now on." 3 months later, Sarah stood in her bakery, watching Alexander teach Matthew how to play chess at one of the tables, while Emma practiced her pirouettes nearby. Rachel worked behind the counter, shooting knowing smiles at her sister. They were taking things slowly, rebuilding their relationship one day at a time. Alexander had moved the majority of his operations to Boston, refusing to miss any more of Matthew's life. He came to the bakery every morning for coffee, just like when they'd first met, but now their children's laughter filled the air. Sarah touched the small velvet box in her pocket, Alexander's grandmother's ring, which he'd given back to her last night. Not as a proposal, but as a promise to rebuild what they'd lost, to create something even stronger. "Mom!" Matthew called excitedly. "Dad's letting me win!" "I am not," Alexander protested, winking at Sarah. "Your son is just brilliant at chess." "Your son, our son." The words that had been a secret burden for so long now filled her with joy instead of pain. Sarah moved to join them, pausing to pull out the torn pieces of the pregnancy test she'd kept all these years. She'd carried them as a reminder of what she'd lost, but now it was time to let go of the past. She dropped them in the trash, watching as Emma twirled past, her daughter's smile bright and unguarded. "Your move," Alexander said softly, and Sarah knew he wasn't just talking about the chess game. She took her seat at the table, surrounded by the family she'd never stopped loving, in the life she'd never stopped hoping for. Sometimes, she realized, the bravest thing you can do is not walk away, but walk back, back to love, back to trust, back to the truth. And this time they would walk forward together.